Next up, we've got Kate, who any of you who were watching yesterday's tracks will have seen Kate basically doing what I'm doing right now. So yes. I would say you're on the other side of the screen, but you're basically looking at the same screen. But you get what I mean.
Yeah.
you're here to impart all your wisdom now.
I'm going to try.
I'm sure you will.
We'll
Got a wealth of knowledge in there, so I'm really interested in hearing your talking. From the looks of my document and everything we're advertising, you're going to be talking about maximizing your game's reach and a quick primer on culturalization, which is another great topic with a lot of actionable things from it.
Absolutely. So let me find,
Perfect.
Why is it not letting me show the right window? Yay. Okay, now you
Perfect.
can see that, right?
I can see that, so I will leave you to it. And just quickly, I will remind everyone to throw your questions for Kate into the Q&A, and I'll be back in a bit, and we'll see what the audience wants to ask.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. And hi, everybody. It's great to be here again. This is going to be really quick. This topic typically needs at least a good hour of explanation. That's why it's called a quick primer on culturalization. So let's just hop in here. So basically, as many of us know, the global game industry revenue is enormous, and it continues to grow at a very rapid rate. The numbers even for this year are already staggering in comparison with this chart from last year. But the point of showing this is that the growth that typically developers are aiming for, when a lot of the developers I work with, they make their game for North America or Western Europe or a lot of the, quote, traditional markets of gaming. But the reality is a lot of the growth around the world is happening in places you don't necessarily expect. And so part of what I try and do with my work as a geographer who's been doing this culturalization work for over 27 years now, in the game industry, is to help developers understand that with some little tweaking here and there of the content, you can actually maximize where your game is able to go, because there's a lot of markets out there that actually are looking for content or desperate for great content, but they may or may not know about your game, or they may not know the appeal of it, because of the theming or whatever else. So basically my focus is looking at, how can we expand the content and get it out there as far as possible. So we know that localization, we're all familiar with localization, I think, which is, to me, is mainly language translation. That makes up a huge chunk of the industry's revenue. But talking about these areas where there's growth that a lot of people are not really looking at is places like Nigeria, Kenya, India, Vietnam, with these massive double-digit growth year over year. And a lot of game designers don't really think about designing for markets like this. They tend to think, again, like I mentioned, more the traditional large gaming markets. There's nothing wrong with that, but then you're also overlooking a massive amount of emerging markets and other places out there that are looking for content and are ready to play. But it may not, but sometimes you have to make some design choices that may need to be made, to tweak your content. Russia's becoming a massive market. China, of course, became the #1 gaming market a couple of years ago, and mobile games surpassed PC gaming in China, which is hugely significant in that market. So we're seeing a lot of shifting going around. We know that a lot of gameplay, a lot of this growth that we're seeing is in mobile as well. And so that's another area that's a core focus, is that we have to think about what I'm trying to basically do with the culturalization process is essentially take the game worlds that developers are making and see how are they compatible with the local worldviews. And so basically I kind of see this like a gene splicing exercise where I'm trying to take the values and the world and everything else that the game developers created and see, is it compatible or not with that local culture, with the local laws, with the government regulations and all that kind of stuff. So I work in the zone of compatibility or incompatibility of content assets. So basically, I'm looking for things that are going to be either problematic for the game being compatible in that culture, or things that are going to actually help the game be more relevant to that specific culture. Now, here's an example of the difference between localization and culturalization. Again, localization, I think most of us are aware of it. It tends to focus more on language translation than anything. But here's an example for you using a Kit Kat bar. So you can see here 2 Kit Kat bars. They're essentially the same product. The top one's from Canada with the English and French wrapper, and the bottom was from Japan with a Japanese wrapper. So same product, different labeling, different languages. That essentially is the core of localization. Now with culturalization, though, it's a completely different concept. So in Japan, what they did with the Kit Kat bar is they actually culturalized this candy bar in a couple of ways. The one thing they did is they used the phrase, they kind of riffed on the phrase kirukatsu, which is a very positive Japanese expression. And so Kit Kat, kirukatsu sounds kind of similar. So they were very lucky actually that the phrase, the Japanese phrase, was very similar to the product name. So they were able to capitalize on that. But the other thing they did is they understand that Japan tends to be a collector culture. That's why games like Pokemon Go are not a surprise, where, you know, gotta catch them all kind of thing. That's very popular in Japan. So they actually culturalized the candy bar in Japan and made different flavors of the candy bar all over the country. You can actually see this map where you can collect different flavors of Kit Kat bars. And this phenomenon doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. This is the only place where they have culturalized Kit Kat bar, because they happen to just sync up really well with those couple of values that they thought would be really useful. And it was, you know, at this point, they've been doing this for over a decade, and they have like, at this point, over 600 different flavors of Kit Kat bars they've created in Japan. So that's a great example of how you would culturalize something. Now, another big difference between culturalization and localization is that typically localization happens later in the product cycle, because you have to wait for the text to be complete, or complete as possible, in order for the content to be ready for localization. But with culturalization, for example, a lot of my work happens at the beginning of the game, because I need to understand what is the world they're creating, who's in it, what kind of characters are there, what kind of races or factions or political groups or religious groups or whatever it might be. So I need to understand exactly what this world is and what happens in this world. Because when you're involved that early, of course, I can make early course corrections on the overall concept that will get the game out of trouble, or actually help them enhance the game for certain places in the world. So it's a lot of times it's just tiny surgical tweaks. It's not like I'm telling them to change the whole concept. It's just little things that I see that I can advise on and basically help them kind of move in the right direction. And so culturalization happening early is extremely important. Here's a couple of examples of reactive and proactive culturalization. So reactive culturalization is essentially removing things that are not going to be compatible with the local market. So like, you may recognize this from Fallout 3. It was a two-headed Brahmin bull that was incompatible with India, because Brahmin bulls are sacred to the Hindu faith. And so they could have used this poorly photoshopped two-headed horse of mine as a replacement, because almost any other animal would have been fine for that market, but they didn't have time and they just didn't want to take the risk. And plus, unfortunately, at the time, they felt that, you know, doing all this work for India wasn't really worth it, which is sad, because, you know, India is one of those massive growing markets. So this is an example, though, where we had to take something out or try and change it. But unfortunately, because they did not change it, this game did not sell in India. Whereas conversely, an example of proactive culturalization in India is when Marvel partnered with a local studio to create this culturalized version of Spider-Man. And the initial reaction was extremely positive. A lot of people felt that this was super cool. It was really cool that they would take this step and actually culturalize this character for their market. However, ultimately, it didn't do that well, because you're dealing with a very famous IP of Spider-Man, who pretty much everyone in the world knows it's Peter Parker in New York City. So what the market in this case actually wanted was a localized version of Spider-Man in the many different languages of India. So, so they had good intentions there, and it was a good attempt, but ultimately that's not what the market wanted. Now, there's multiple considerations we have to take on and think about when we are doing culturalization work. It's not just about looking for whether or not this gesture is sensitive or whatever. We have to think about the high-level company values and goals. For example, are you as a company ready to have a game that shows Taiwan as an independent country in it, even if it's a fictional scenario? Because that scenario will get you banned in China, and it'll be a lot of problems for you. And so you have to decide as a company and as a creator, where am I willing to draw the line on things I will or will not change? Another thing is the context in which content is generated is very important, because every place and every person, we're all biased. We have to recognize that no matter what, we are biased because of where we grew up, where our cultural background and all of that. And most of us do a good job of overcoming our bias because we are educated and we are enlightened. But that doesn't always happen in the creative process, because in the creative process, we're in a state of flow, and some of the things that we create sometimes reflect our bias. I'm not saying the bias is necessarily negative in a really grievous way. It just shows that we may not understand another culture or a particular racial group or whatever it might be as well as we should in order to represent them in the game. The other thing is the business strategy for the verticals. So this is really relevant for large companies like Microsoft and Sony, where they make other things other than games. Market strategy for the locale, because a lot of companies, they may shift their strategy depending on the market, because a lot of markets are different. You know, trying to sell games in China is vastly different from trying to sell games in Saudi Arabia versus Brazil versus the United States. The market strategy for a specific game is also important. And then also the changing geopolitical and cultural and ethical factors, because the world is very dynamic. As we all know, the last few months have shown us this very starkly, that the world is dynamic. For example, when the USK, the game rating agency in Germany a couple of years ago, decided that Nazi symbology is now okay, which was kind of a major shift for that ratings agency to make that decision. So now, you know, this is an example from Wolfenstein 2, where you could see on the left, that's what most of the world saw, but in Germany, they saw the other versions without the swastika. Or if you're Blizzard, you learned very quickly last year about the dangers of geopolitics in China and the whole cluster fund that happened around their Hearthstone tournament. They learned very quickly that you have to have a strategy for this kind of stuff. And yeah, I'm not even going to go into this. This would take me another couple hours to debrief on what Blizzard did wrong, because they made a huge mistake. Another thing we have to think about is different themes in our game. So like if you have a historical game, history is extremely sensitive in different markets. So for example, I've worked on all the Age of Empires titles, and history, as we deal with it in Age of Empires, is somewhat generalized, and it's supposed to be for the sake of gameplay. Well, here's a scenario from the original Age of Empires where we actually had to change history in order to appease the Korean government, because the scenario that you see on the top, where the Japanese invaded the Chosun Empire back in the Middle Ages, that the Korean Ministry of Information said that never happened. So we had to make a very careful decision on our side, and being at Microsoft at the time, all of those multiple considerations that I mentioned a few minutes ago, we had to kind of work through all of that. Like, what does Microsoft want to do? We want to grow our games business. We know Korea is a very important gaming market. We know that real-time strategy games are extremely popular there, you know, and so what are we willing to do? Well, this is a case where, because there were other precedents that had been set at the company, where the decision was made, you know, we're basically just going to serve up the local expectation and so we had to do a special patch, which you can see on the bottom, which is where the Koreans invade Japan instead, which is definitely not history or historically accurate. So, but there's a lot of things in Age of Empires that are not historically accurate. There's tech trees that have different cultures having units that they never had before. So there's quite a bit of fiction in Age of Empires anyway. So we felt that this was we kind of fit that leeway a bit. Dealing with faith is also very important. Both of these games had audio files that had lyrics or chanting from the Islamic Quran in them, which was highly inappropriate to use that in a game, whether or not the game is M-rated like the Kakudu Chojin was, which was a game that I worked on, or Little Big Planet, which is obviously a much more innocuous, fun, you know, game. So the point being here is that you have to be extremely careful about your source materials. You can't just pick like an audio file and use it because you say, wow, it sounds cool, I think I'll use it. If there's lyrics or whatever it else might be, you have to do the due diligence to figure out exactly what's the source of this, what are the lyrics, what language is it, what are they saying, all of that kind of stuff. You have to do that. Otherwise, just, you know, the other rule is just don't use music with lyrics. Just steer clear of that, because that's how both of these games got in trouble. Other things too is a very broad category of dealing with the perception of being excluded from the experience or included based on your gender, your race, your nationality, your culture, all of these things. And these issues happen a lot in games. this game that was a mobile game that came out quite a while ago, Pocket God, you can see here their portrayal of indigenous people is not very positive. It's very antiquated with the bone in the hair, the grass skirt, and they've got like little sharp teeth. So they're kind of like little animals. And part of the issue with this game is that your mission on this game is to torture these people. So that's basically what you do. And the designers of the game said, well, this is just total fiction. It's not a specific culture, so don't worry about it. But a lot of Polynesian groups were upset. Why were they upset? Because of this, a moai. And you can see on their island, they put a moai, which that makes this a specific exact culture, because the moai exists only on one place on Earth, which is Easter Island. So you can see in later versions of the game, they actually changed it to something different and took out that cultural artifact. Also things like character design, like I worked on games where we had to adapt the female armor in order to be compatible with Middle Eastern game players and Middle Eastern, sensitivities. And frankly, when I showed this artwork to a lot of people in North America and Europe, they thought the women, the ones on the right, looked far better anyway, which I happen to agree with. So we have to be mindful of things like this. Also geopolitical issues, like I alluded to earlier about the whole China-Taiwan issue. Here's a great example where just in the options screen for the game, this was Ninja Gaiden that I worked on, you could see where it says country select, and it has ROC, which is Republic of China, and it has the Taiwan flag. This will get you instantly banned in China because this is a very volatile political statement. You're calling Taiwan the Republic of China, and you're saying it's a country. So in order to fix something like this, here's a quick fix if you watch closely. So we call it country/region, and then we use the term Taiwan because it's used by both sides. It's acceptable. We take out the Taiwan flag because it's redundant information. We don't need to use flags to represent language or location. And so this works. So in this case, is Taiwan a country or a region? That's for the user to perceive. It's not for you to assert as a creator. And this happens all the time. I've done a lot of work with Google and a lot of non-game companies where we have to adapt content based on either government regulation or local expectations. You can see here's an example of the northern part of India, in Jammu and Kashmir, where in India, you must show it as Indian territory or else your product will be instantly banned. And so you have to get this stuff right. So as I'm closing here, just a few quick thoughts. So we know that distribution in the cloud brings with it a lot of great advantages, but it also brings a lot of challenges. So like speed, we instantly get our content out there and it's being instantly exposed to a broad multicultural audience. And in today's world, we're dealing, along with that audience, we're dealing with massive communities on social media and elsewhere where activism is very high level. And so we know we've seen this, we've all experienced this, we're seeing it right now as I speak, that this is a real force of nature that companies have to contend with and creators have to deal with. So basically the point is that you need to strive to get it right upon release, because once it's out there and there's no taking it back. So you have to do your best to try and get it right. And also this whole issue that we're dealing with is this battle over mind share. This is why when governments are trying to control what their people get to see, what gets to influence them, and video games are seen as unfortunately, in a lot of places still, are seen as a somewhat negative influence on citizens. So this is a reason why the Great Firewall of China exists, for example, to try and block out certain kinds of content. So this is something we need to be mindful of as well. But I want to leave you with a very important point, because I know a lot of people, when they hear a topic like this, they're like, oh my God, this means I need to change my idea. I need to do this and that. I need to basically appease all these governments and people. No, not necessarily. I think you need to exercise your creative vision, but you can't expect that vision to align with other cultures. So if your desire is to see your game go to as many cultures as possible, you're going to have to think about these issues on some level. So basically, you have to be extremely conscious of all the creative decisions you're making during the world building process to know and to think about what will or will not be compatible with these markets to which you wish your game to go. And so basically what we're dealing with is this, what I call the fulcrum of compromise, where you're striving for artistic freedom and you would love to create the game you want to make without any restrictions, which I absolutely encourage people to do. But if you have the desire for your game to go global and to be seen all over the place, then you have to think about how you would change things, deal with reactive and proactive culturalization, and these other factors that I mentioned very briefly. So a lot of developers are kind of struggling on this fulcrum between wanting pure artistic freedom and putting out art versus actually wanting to make money and pay their bills. And so in order to do so, culturalization helps kind of on both of those levels. You want your game to go as many places as possible, but you also want to maintain your artistic freedom. And it's a struggle every person in the game industry has, and the struggle is real. So, but culturalization is one of those things that can actually help facilitate dealing with this struggle a bit better. So there's a very quick primer. I hope that helped. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. That was fascinating. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, this is literally my jam: languages, culture, the world, adaptions, everything else like that. I'm the person who's got like 3 different versions of the same game from different countries and stuff.
Awesome.
So yeah, no, this was brilliant. And I'm really glad you mentioned the Kit Kat stuff at the start as well, because when I lived in Japan, I went on a task of traveling around trying all the different versions of Fanta, because they do the same with Fanta as well.
Exactly. Yeah, some of my Japanese colleagues have admitted to me that they've done Kit Kat tourism in Japan.
Yes, I've got some under my bed actually that were brought back by a friend as a gift. So yeah, we've got some questions. Well, we've got 2 questions in, so I'll jump straight into them if that's all right with you. So
yeah.
Jackie says, great presentation, which I wholeheartedly agree. And she says, have you ever had to deal with a crisis by changing a game rapidly? And did it work? Or have you got any examples of companies who have gotten it wrong, caused a crisis, but dealt with it really well by changing their game quickly?
Yes, there's the answer is yes to both. And I've dealt directly with both. I mean, I think, yeah, I don't think we have enough time to go into all the examples that I could mention. So you're always welcome to follow up with me and I could elaborate. But the answer is yes. There has been some examples where, like the Kakuto Chojin example I showed earlier, that's with the early days of Xbox. That is a great example of how not to handle it. Because basically they had an audio file. It was identified as the game was already packaged and literally rolling on trucks to stores. It wasn't on the shelves yet in North America, but it was going. And so the problem was identified. They fixed it immediately. It put in like a non-lyric audio file. But then the decision was made, and this is where the breakdown happened, is to go ahead and release those tainted units in North America only. And me as a geographer, I'm like, you realize, of course, that, there's 8 million Muslims in the United States or more, that like places like Detroit are 50% Muslim. We're not a homogeneous society here. And so I'm like, if you release that in the US, people are going to notice. And they did notice, because 3 months later, the government of Saudi Arabia contacted Microsoft and we had a huge problem. And the game was eventually globally recalled because it was receiving so much negative PR in the Middle East. And I had to go to Saudi Arabia and do damage control and all that. But the result of that is that they created internal processes that I helped with that actually made sure that other games in the future would not have to go through that. And since then, they've done a phenomenal job. There's other companies, well, like by contrast, just in the same vein, that when Little Big Planet had a similar issue, they handled it a lot better, but that's because they had the value of hindsight. They actually had known about what happened with Kakuto Chojin. So when they had a similar issue, they did not release the game. They actually delayed it for 3 weeks so that they could actually fix the problem. They put out a little press release saying, this is why we're fixing it. And they were very open and transparent about why. They still got a lot of backlash because people were like, how could you be so stupid to use an audio file that has that in there? You should have known better. But as we know, Little Big Planets did come out and it was very successful and has been. And so, so basically that, just with that one example of the audio files, there was quite a contrast in how it was handled.
Yeah, exactly. It's like what they say, isn't it? But I can't remember the phrase properly, but a late game is only, late once, but a bad game is bad forever. And I know it's not quite the same, but, if the error's in there, the error's in there. Whereas, if a delay is a delay.
Absolutely.
Dax has asked, well, he first of all says, thanks for the insightful session, and says, we are a studio based in India, but we still have to test our prototypes in the US market as publishers want that. As India is a growing gaming market, do you think we should test games in India? Will big publishers be open to trying that?
My answer is yes. I think so. I mean, India's growth is substantial, and I can understand completely why they would want the testing to be done in the U.S. But honestly, I mean, the testing needs to be done more than the U.S. I mean,
Yeah.
Easily. I mean, the U.S. is a cluster fund right now anyway. Speaking as an American, but yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to get diverse viewpoints on testing. I mean, having just testing only in the U.S., for example, is to me a non-starter. You have to at least do the U.S. You need to at least do a couple of countries in Europe, and ideally, I think in Asia, India is a prime candidate. I think India would be a great place to do that testing, especially because India, has the English-speaking legacy, which I think helps. So that helps with a certain level of legibility.
Yeah, I completely agree with you as well. And especially with what you're saying is, especially with how volatile markets are at the moment. I mean, the UK is obviously volatile as well. So only testing in the UK would not sort of be indicative of global values at the moment. So one other question we've got is, when developers are deciding which areas outside of Europe, USA, China to focus on, which do you think would be they say the top three, or which ones would you basically advise to look at outside of the main regional hubs?
No, that's a great question. I think part of my answer is going to say it depends on the type of game that you're making, because there certainly are preferences in different markets here and there. But generally speaking, some of the areas that I would be looking out for, I would definitely be looking at Southeast Asia. Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, that whole region. I mean, the growth in that area has been pretty substantial. So I would take a look at Southeast Asia. The Middle East often gets overlooked pretty significantly by a lot of developers, but the Middle East, the game consumption in the Middle East has been growing pretty steadily for years now at a nice pace. So I know a lot of developers tend to shy away from it because they instantly assume that it's going to be a huge headache because of Sharia law and all the other issues I have to deal with, but it isn't. I mean, there's tons of great examples of very viable games that sell very well in the Middle East, and it's a market that is very hungry for content. So that's another one I would look at. A couple of other areas, Latin America, of course. Yeah. I think that's sort of a given. But also, we're seeing a lot more interest in more culturalized games or more local theming for Eastern Europe as well.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
The Balkan region, all the way up through Poland, Belarus, all of that area.
Yeah, definitely. I can agree with that as well. And we see a lot of that with in terms of the indie developers at the big indie pitch side coming along. They're coming from those sorts of regions as well, which is just great to see the spread of diversity in gaming.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think that's time for this talk. But yeah, thank you so much for being a part of this and pulling double duty as well, because you were here all of yesterday running the same time track, and so thank you so much for coming back and being a part of it here.
No, I'm always happy to support PGC. It's fun.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, fascinating talk. I loved every minute of it, so thank you.
All right. Thanks. See you. Bye-bye.